you said at the outset about advocating for reform in this particular moment. And I mean, I happen to know, like I said at the outset, that Andrew Kliman, since the election of Trump, has become more and more convinced that the task of socialists and Marxists today is to fight off the right-wing reactionary forces. And if that means supporting center right-wing candidates, then so be it. Anyway, so in the second half, we might be take our gloves off a little bit politically for the patrons, and this will give me an opportunity to try to weasel $5 out of a MHI member so they can get the information and give it to Kliman. Well, hello, Diet Soap viewers and readers. It's 2 a.m. where I am, which I think is my explanation for looking like this, although I always look like this. It's Pop the Left. And today we have Ted Reese and Ashley Frawley with us. Ashley is going to take the lead in this podcast, and I'm going to turn it over to her to begin.
Thanks, Doug. So one of the things that I is really close to my heart is crisis theory. I'm really curious about where capitalism is heading and how that leads us to particular ways of organizing, particular ways of understanding trends within capitalism. And one of the most important thinkers in this debate, I think, is someone called Henryk Grossman. Now, not a lot of people know who Henryk Grossman was, but he was a Marxist economist who was writing the first half of the 20th century. And quite famously, he predicted or appeared to predict the stock market crash in 1929 when he published his very well-timed Law of Accumulation and Breakdown, which was, of course, published on the eve of the Great Depression. And he seemed to be one of the few people at the time who saw this crisis looming on the horizon. So I think he's a figure that we should pay close attention to. But in addition to producing a series of important works developing Marx's theories of economic crisis, he also subjected mainstream economic theory to rigorous critique. So if you want to understand how Marxism stands up to what mainstream economists in the academy are working in central banks and so on, if you want to see how our theories stand up to them, Grossman is your guy. But his ideas aren't widely known, as I said, but a lot of people on the left are trying to change that. And so our guest today is someone who's written several books, one of which is The End of Capitalism, The Thought of Henryk Grossman. So hi, Ted Reese.
Hi, Ashley. Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for coming. Well, we wanted to talk to you about your new book, but we also want to dig into a recent critique of Grossman's work by a Marxist economist named Andrew Kliman. Now, I don't know about Doug, but about a decade ago, Kliman's work was a pretty huge influence on me as I was trying to understand Marxist economics. So seeing Kliman critique Grossman was a little bit like watching your parents fight. So I really want to go into this debate because it gets kind of obscure, and there's a lot of math going on, and there are a lot of graphs, and I think it's a little bit above our pay grade. So we're really glad to have you, and I wondered if you could kind of, in addition to talking about your book, walk us through this new critique, this supposedly devastating critique of Grossman's ideas, because I take it you don't think it's a devastating critique.
No, I don't. I just feel like he's trying to reinvent what Grossman actually said fundamentally. Like he's critiquing something that Grossman didn't say, which is quite common when it comes to critics of Grossman. So, I mean,
maybe we should start off by outlining the the major point of disagreement between Kliman and Grossman, as Kliman sees it, which I think has to do primarily with whether or not capitalism does head for a breakdown rather than perpetual crises, which then get resolved through devaluation.
Yeah. So
is that the main point of disagreement, or is that what the debate is about?
Ashley, can I just ask, when you said that Kliman was like a role model, sort of, a leading thinker for you, why was that, just briefly?
Because he seemed to be rescuing Marx's labor theory of value from criticisms that said it was internally inconsistent and couldn't possibly be true.
Yeah, see, I agree with that. I think Kliman has written some really good stuff, verifying the labor theory of value, if you like. So on that level, I was surprised on that level, because Grossman's theory is based on the labor value of theory as well.
Yeah, he wrote The Failure of Capitalist Production, but before that Kliman did, Reclaiming Marx's Capital. So, yeah, he was definitely someone who had a big influence on me. In fact, for a time, I was a member of the Marxist Humanist Initiative before Trump was elected, and I was deemed to be insufficiently outraged by Trump. Not that I wasn't outraged, but just I was insufficient. So why would you be surprised, though, Ted, that Kliman would be in the background for Marxists today, or an influence?
Why would I be surprised that he's an influence?
Yeah, or what? I mean, you seem surprised that Ashley would cite him as someone who was an influence.
No, I'm not surprised. Like I say, I think he's done good work on the labor theory of value. What I'm surprised about is that he can't see, or claims not to be able to see, that Grossman's work was based on the same theory.
That's the thing I don't understand, is I actually know about Grossman's work because of Kliman. And I thought that he was a champion of Kliman, and now he seems to be. He says that Grossman is fundamentally wrong. But I think, for those who aren't familiar, could you actually tell us a little bit more about Henryk Grossman? Like, I gave a little bit of an introduction, but what is the main kind of idea that you think is the most important thing to take from Grossman's work? Because I think it's that idea that Kliman's criticizing, isn't it?
Yeah, so Grossman argues that capitalism suffers from a continual or cyclical overproduction of capital. So this is capital that basically becomes surplus. It can't be reinvested or invested back into production, so it has to be channeled into speculation or other avenues and means of finding profit or improving or rewidening, thinning profit margins. At the same time, this is an underproduction of surplus value, right?
What does that mean?
So surplus value is surplus labor time. So let's say, and this is what we're getting to, the labor theory of value now. So let's just say you work 8 hours a day. If we actually measured your, if you got your pay slip and your income is actually measured in time, you would see that, let's say, 4 hours of your 8 have gone to the capitalist, and you've only kept 4. So that's what Marx is unveiling, right? So that's that 4 hours that goes to the capitalist is surplus value or surplus labor time. So capitalism suffers from an underproduction of surplus value or surplus labor time relative to the amount of existing total capital that needs to be renewed and expanded for capital to keep accumulating.
So what you mean by that is that over time, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but over time, capitalists end up spending relatively more on machines and fixed things that aren't human than they do on human beings. But the main source of profit is human labor.
Yeah, because the contradictions in capitalism mean that to offset this overaccumulation that happens every like with every cycle, let's say, Marx talked about it happening on average every 10 years. So to fix this overaccumulation, they have to do several counteracting things, such as cheapening the means of production, devaluing them, expanding production, raising the rate of labour's productivity, cheapening labour. Like, all of these things are intermingled. They're all happening at the same time and complement one another. And then that allows capital to start accumulating again on a higher basis. But it needs the crisis to be able to do those things. Grossman points out that innovation and expansion happens the most in the aftermath or during a crisis when prices are low, because you get this overproduction of goods that you can't sell. So the capitalist cuts the prices to try and get rid of them, or they destroy them. In which case prices are more likely to go up. They can do either or. They probably start with one and go towards the other on average. So yeah, that crisis is absolutely fundamental. The capitalist system needs the recession before it can go on to a higher level of accumulation.
My understanding was that innovation and the disciplining of labor and the speed up of production were major factors that brought on crisis. That as you could produce more commodities per hour using less labor, that would bring down the rate of profit, and that would lead to crisis. Is that true? Yes,
that's true, but it's both. This is what Grossman's pointing out. The counter tendencies are the same. It's like an elastic band. It's the same piece of elastic. The counter tendency is countering the normal tendency. So they're working against each other, and so
you'll have innovation and speed up all along, and then a crisis will hit, and it will actually intensify that.
Yeah, tendency. So it might relieve the breakdown tendency to start with, and it does for a while, because you're producing more commodities to offset the fact that, for example, to offset the fact that the amount of profit per commodity you were selling had fallen. So what do? You sell even more commodities to offset that, right? So that counteracts the tendency for a while. But in the long run, the same problem occurs. You've got even less profit, or you tend to have even less profit per commodity.
Mm-hmm. So they're raising the massive profit, but they're not raising the rate of profit, so that the total amount of profit is going higher, but they're not able to raise the rate. I mean, surely they're able to raise the rate a bit somehow.
Well, I mean, this is the thing with Kliman. He talks about the rate of profit, the falling rate of profit being the problem, and not the massive profit, which is what Grossman talks about. But they're really the same thing. This is what confuses me in Kliman's critique of Grossman. Is he complains that Grossman talks too much about the massive profit, but all Grossman is pointing out is that the rate of profit is a representation of the massive profit relative to total capital that needs to be valorized.
Could you explain that? So the relative to the total capital that needs to be valorized, what does that mean?
So you need a sufficient amount of profit or surplus value, essentially the same thing, relative to the total amount of capital in order to expand capital yet further. So capital always needs to keep accumulating because it tends to devalue. So you need to accumulate it further to offset that, right?
Well, just to be clear, so you have the massive capital at the beginning of a year, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
and you put people to work producing new commodities over the course of that year, and the task of the workers is to reproduce the massive profit. I mean, the massive capital
Mm-hmm.
that was invested, that's already in place, and add new value through their work as well.
Right.
Correct. So
Yeah.
the rate of profit, the rate of surplus value, the production of surplus value, is a measure of how much additional value at what speed is added to the massive profit through exploitation. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, but you yeah. Okay, so, but you could have an increase in the mass of capital without that just was slower, that took more time than it had in the past. So the rate of exploitation, the rate of the addition of surplus value, the rate of profit would decline, but the mass would continue to expand and grow.
Yeah,
Correct?
that's right. Yeah.
And so my understanding from reading Kliman was that Grossman believed that at a certain point that you would no longer have an increasing mass of profit, no longer have an increasing mass of capital, that it couldn't reproduce itself.
Yeah, at some point, at like a very late point, that you get an absolute decline in the mass of profit, but you tend to get a rise in the mass of profit, and even when that happens, you can still have a recession or a capitalist crisis.
Right.
But at some point, you do get an absolute decline in the mass of profit as well.
So the difference between Kliman and Grossman is that Kliman doesn't believe that you could ever get to a point, or that you necessarily or inevitably will get to a point where there's that breakdown, where you're no longer adding to the mass of capital through profit making.
Yeah, which is wrong.
Right. Okay, so we understand what the technical, basic disagreement would be about, but and what Kliman was critiquing Grossman for. But what we don't understand are two other things, or what we haven't talked about are two other things. One is that Kliman accuses Grossman of setting up fatalism, even though Grossman was not a fatalist himself.
Which he said.
Yeah. And also, the other interesting thing is that Kliman shifts the terrain from this level of abstract profit making, which is based on the labor time, to the level of actual use values, to the level of physical stuff. He claims that Grossman, when he's talking about the mass of capital, is really talking about the mass of useful commodities rather than the value associated with them. And that is a move that I didn't understand how Kliman got there, or how what Kliman meant that there's a necessary connection between the abstract labor time, the value created, and the commodities produced, and how you would. Kliman seemed to say you should be able to even measure the impact on the production of useful commodities in the same way that you would the creation of surplus value as an abstract labor time, as socially necessary labor. So maybe we can get to. I mean, maybe I'm jumping ahead too quickly, but because I think that before we get to that, there's maybe a general disagreement you would have with Kliman's interpretation of Grossman, and because you said at the outset that Kliman seems to be misreading Grossman or misunderstanding Grossman, and getting him wrong. So what would you say his primary mistake is, or his misreading is. Ted.
Well, fundamentally, he recognizes that Grossman is saying that there's an underproduction of surplus value. But he then says that Grossman's schemes actually show something else. He says that it shows he says something like it's too much investment or too much physical output relative to investment demand. It does show that, but on the surface, not on the underlying theory that is based on the labour theory of value. So I don't know why he's just chosen to look at he's effectively ignored the underlying theory and jumped up a level to what Grossman shows happens on the surface level. And this is what Grossman is always criticising other Marxists of doing, is of ignoring Marx's abstractions, which simplify, and sort of interpreting them as the surface level conclusions that Marx then works back towards to. So Grossman's very clear that Marx starts from an abstract schema based on the value, and then reintroduces the elements that were taken out to simplify the theory and the schema, and works back towards a sort of a more reality-based capitalism with all of the fundamental features reintroduced. Kliman is making the same mistake that other Marxists made, that Grossman criticised. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we need to go over it all again to make it clear.
Yeah.
For the people who are not already up to speed, but I understand the basic claim. I understand that. I mean, certainly when Kliman claims that Grossman is really talking about use values, he's really talking about the massive physical objects and not being able to reproduce and expand the mass of commodities and useful things. He's talking about what often is thought of as the level of appearance. People think about capitalism in terms of these useful things that get produced and reproduced. But he does make an argument as to how, the abstract labor and the real labor or physical labor are connected, and how measures of value and measures of commodities ought to be comparable or not. That doesn't mean that there should be a one-to-one correlation, but that somehow the decline in the amount of socially necessary labor time that's being reproduced should correlate in some way with a decline or a change in the level of useful values that are made, or useful items or commodities that are created. But I'm gonna let you two talk for just a second. But I want to set up what, just to keep people who are not value nerds interested. What does Kliman think the political consequences of this are? What is at stake politically for Marxism in this debate? Do you think?
Well, firstly, as you say, he accuses. He doesn't accuse Grossman of being a fatalist, but he accuses the modern day Grossmanites, such as myself, I assume, of being fatalists, in the sense that we don't do anything, we just wait around waiting for capitalism to collapse.
Yeah. And this is the thing, is that they're basically, it's this idea that, well, if this, Marxists keep saying, oh, this is the final breakdown, this is the final crisis, and they've been saying this for like 100 years, and it's never the final crisis. So it seems to undermine Marxist theory. And the other thing is, oh, well, capitalism's inevitably going to break down, so hey, sit back, relax, and let it happen. And that's obviously fatalistic as well. And that's the thing, is that I tend to do that myself. So I felt like personally attacked when Kliman writes that there are all these Marxists on YouTube who think that, oh well, the end of capitalism is inevitable. And I thought, well, I kind of think that, but I don't think it's going to inevitably tend to socialism. I think it'll inevitably tend to nuclear war or something like that. So how is that wrong? How is that charge incorrect? Help me, because I need to defend myself.
Yeah. So on the other side, he accuses people of either being like that or being overconfident in a way that, in terms of Che Guevara outlook, who expressed his confidence that capitalism would break down, and so socialist revolution would happen. So I think what he's doing is he's trying to justify reformism, because he's saying we've got to struggle for reforms now, and instead of waiting for capitalism to break down. But Grossman agrees that part of the class struggle is to struggle for reforms that improve the condition of the working class. The problem is that as the working class succeeds in securing reforms, that actually deepens the crisis of capitalism, of course, because if you win a struggle for higher employment or higher wages or better working conditions that eat into capital's tax base, then that's going to eat into profit margins and the amount of surplus value that can be dedicated to capital accumulation. So Grossman is fundamentally saying that the class struggle is bound up with the necessity of struggling for socialism in the end. But he also says that even if the working class isn't succeeding in winning progressive reforms, that the system will still break down, because it will. The fundamental problem for capitalism is that it is working towards its own abolition. It is fundamentally abolishing the source of profit in terms of introducing automated machinery that is replacing commodity producing labor, right? So there's a smaller and smaller pool of labor that has to work harder and harder to reproduce capital yet further. So that's the problem that has to be wrestled with. Grossman doesn't really talk about automation per se, but he's saying the amount of capital that has to be reproduced by a relatively smaller pool of labor is increasing. So you can see the contradiction there. It's getting harder and harder for labor to reproduce capitalism. So the capitalist is therefore compelled to attack labor to reduce the wages and anything else that is going that is taking away from profit margins and surplus value that can be dedicated to capital. So that then compels the working class to fight back, because the working class presumably wants to survive like any other class of humans. So the Grossman's theory of class struggle is fundamentally bound up with his theory of accumulation and breakdown.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, I mean, it seemed to me that, on the one hand, I thought Kliman's claim about fatalism, that it could lead you to be quiescent and just to sort of play the game of the spectator instead of the engaged activist, and simultaneously could lead you to be overconfident in your activism. In other words, any attack that you make on the ruling class, any attack that you make on capitalist forms of production will be sufficient, given the fact that you're backed basically by the winds of history. You're being pushed by the internal contradictions of capitalism. So you're bound to hit the right target eventually, is sort of the idea. I can see how both those things might be the outcome of a fatalistic attitude, and fatalism is usually associated with defeat or a lack of success, or a kind of nihilism. But in this case, it's not that. It's just that you feel that fate is on your side, history is on your side, that you're determined by the system of capitalism itself, that you're politically determined by capitalism itself to win out, to win socialism. Of course, even the most fatalistic socialists would say, or at least maybe that's not true, but certainly Grossman would say that a breakdown doesn't necessarily lead to socialism. It gives us a choice between socialism or chaos, barbarism. And so that, what's fated is not clear, even from a fatalistic attitude.
Yeah.
So what I don't quite understand is what the political ramifications will be if you don't have the idea that capitalism is headed for a technical breakdown, meaning because from just a historical point of view, the crises of capitalism have been rather deep. The last one that was really horrific, truly horrific, was the Great Depression in World War II, which was a completely monstrous crisis. And if you think of World War II as the devaluation of capital, a truly horrific crisis of capitalism. So the difference between a breakdown that's happening on the level of production and value, and depression that leads to a massive devaluation, in terms of the spectators or the participants, might not be that significant. But I guess the difference would be in the case of the terminal breakdown, you would not have the ability to have a massive war, devalue capital enough to reset and rise phoenix-like from the ashes with a new round of capitalist production and a new boom. And would that be the difference?
Potentially, yes, because I think in the past, like, a world war has been necessary to sufficiently devalue capital, sufficiently destroy enough surplus capital to enable accumulation to resume on a higher basis. So in World War One, Grossman quotes a book, I can't remember who it's from now, but it states that 35% of global wealth was destroyed in World War One, and that enabled accumulation to resume on a higher level. I don't know what the figure is for World War Two, but I assume it's even higher than that. So for me, we're getting towards a stage where, because capitalism is so much bigger now, you would have to intuit that a world war would need to destroy even more wealth to enable capital to resume on a higher level again. But I don't really think that, I don't really think it would be I think it would have to destroy the whole system, because there's really nowhere left for capitalism to go other than to continue automating production now, because it needs to raise the rate of productivity and cheapen production, raise the speed of circulation, all that. I think we've seen a fundamental and decisive shift in production now, where automation is really what they're investing in. They're not just investing in expansion of this or just improving mechanized machinery. It really is automation now, and even to the point that they are now they're shifting investment towards things like precision fermentation, which is, according to Rethink X, is going to basically bring prices of food production down to zero within the next 15 years. And that is, I don't know if you've read about it, but it's essentially what they call programmed, like a programmed microbialization of food production. And basically you'd be able to replicate the DNA of food proteins, whether that's meat or plants, an unlimited supply of food protein, just from having a piece of DNA in a lab. And
but what you would need to, I mean, you'd need to have something that you are converting. You need to have some material, some raw materials that you were using.
Well, the DNA is the raw material, I guess. I mean,
but what would the DNA be replicating through? You know what I mean? I guess I'm having trouble. With biology now.
Yeah. What's the input?
What's the input?
Let's assume that this is possible. And let's also assume that they need to do it because they need to cheapen production. So as soon as a company like Nestle decides that the milk it's buying is too expensive relative to its profit margins, it starts to buy milk produced by precision fermentation because it's so much cheaper. Or even it might not even buy that milk from another company. It might buy the means to actually produce that milk itself, basically for free. That means the milk industry, the farms that produce milk, which are already starting to become quite highly automated, they will collapse. So the farming industry is in real trouble now, or the traditional farming industry. So and then there's 3D printing, which is bringing down the prices of production extremely rapidly. So, for example, there's a private spaceship building company. I can't remember the name, but they reduced the cost of their production from building an engine for their spaceship from I think it was $2 million in 24 months to about £2,000 in 2 weeks. So this is the sort of thing that's happening, and that also means that they don't need to exploit labor. They don't need to outsource production to exploit cheaper labor in other countries. They can just 3D print at home, so to speak, and then they cut out all the costs of distribution as well, or of importing it back in. So we're at the point where the prices of production are just so low that even if you had a war to try and destroy the surplus capital, I mean, I think essentially what's happening is that all capital is becoming surplus. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen immediately in the next few years. It might be 10 or 20, 30 years. I can't say for sure, but that is the stage we're at. We're not back in 1929. That's not where we are. We're not back in 1848, or we're not starting from scratch. Like people seem to think, oh, the communist or the socialist movement is really weak and small at the moment. We're not even in 1848. I've seen people say that sort of thing. That's not the case. We are a fundamentally new stage in the crisis of capitalism because, as Grossman says, the bigger the system gets, the harder it falls. And so capital is going to be compelled to attack labor like never before, which in terms of intensity and broadness. And that is why a broader section of the working class will have to fight back more intensely this time than in the past, which is what Grossman's really getting at. I don't think he spelt this out, but when we look back at his work and say, and sort of think, oh, well, he was wrong because the world didn't become socialist. It only became partially socialist, and most of those socialist revolutions faded away and sort of reverted to capitalism in the end. That's the wrong way of looking at it. Essentially, the crisis wasn't deep enough. Like the crisis of capitalism in the 20th century. I actually think, in hindsight, because I mean, at the time, communists were saying these wars were the death knell of capitalism. I tend to see them more now as the birth pangs of monopoly capital.
Yeah, I mean, people said that right after World War II, Marxists were saying that monopoly capital had been born out of, or state capitalism had been born out of the war, and not only that, but that it was going to be able to overcome the contradictions in capital. Like, you read Marcuse, for instance, and there was a feeling that monopoly capital was going to be sustainable, that the problems of capitalist production and the contradictions were mostly down to coming out of competition and irregularities in the market, and with state control, those could be overcome. And the sad thing from the point of view of the Frankfurt School philosophers like Marcuse and also others was that the exploitation of labor would continue, or at least the form of wage labor would continue on without there being a drive for conflict, without class conflict. Essentially, that was the thought of even Marxists after World War II. But I'm maybe getting off on a tangent here, because one of the things first of all, when it comes to 3D printing, while the capitalist production, like the manufacture or the industrial production of goods may become extremely cheap, you still would have to have workers produce the raw materials that goes into the 3D printer. I mean, I've seen things be printed that way, and it doesn't just come out of the air. There's a material that you put into the 3D printer, and that's got to be generated somewhere. And you can't 3D print the raw materials for your 3D printer, not yet.
But can you ferment them with this precision fermentation? Now, that seems to be the implication that they're making. Right? The cost of producing a ton via this method was $1 million 20 years ago, but now it's $100. So the cost of doing it are clearly also falling towards zero. And if it does what it says it can do, it will be able to produce fibrous materials, plant-based fibrous materials that potentially you could put into a 3D printer. There's also talk of a mycelium revolution, where you can coax mycelium into any sort of fibrous structure. And then there's things like hemp, which can be grown very quickly, that we don't, you can make most fibrous structures that we need from hemp, including things like computers and phones. Same goes for mycelium. But we don't do it because growing hemp isn't very you can't exploit labor very, very much when it comes to, growing hemp or mycelium in a lab or this precision fermentation stuff.
So are you telling me that in the future I'll be able to smoke my phone? Is that what you're telling me? Okay.
Can I ask though? Wait, you said that they don't do it because they don't have an incentive, because you can't exploit labor. But for capitalists are not on the whole trying to do things that are good for the health of the capitalist system. So wouldn't it be good for an individual capitalist to do that, to be fully automated?
Would it be good for the capitalists to be fully automated?
Not fully. I mean, their own thing, their own production to be fully automated. So if you were the person who was able to do that, you would create any new value yourself because you wouldn't be exploiting labor, very much labor, but you would be able to appropriate value in exchange. That is, if there are other people creating phones using the old process of mining things in very labor intensive ways, then, and you're able to just print it, but you're going to sell your commodity for just a little bit cheaper than theirs. Well, you're going to take all their surplus labor over to you. So that's a great thing. So why wouldn't they do it?
Yeah, exactly. So the monopoly capitalists are the ones who are able to automate the most because they can invest the most. They have the most capital, and then they can essentially leech surplus value that's actually being created by smaller capitals through the way that the hierarchical system of capital is arranged through that monopoly relationship. They change the laws. They're doing it all the time now to, they're legislating in favor of monopoly capital so that it can more easily crush or leech off of smaller capital. This is why we're seeing a lot of the resistance to the lockdowns coming from the smaller right-wing capitalists, as opposed to the monopoly capitalists.
I have a question here. I don't want to stop. Go ahead, Ashley. Go. You asked to follow up.
I didn't know if I was going to take it too far off course, but that was one thing that I wanted to ask you, because I know that a lot of what you're talking about is applicable today, even though Grossman, you're saying it's not the same situation, but the same kind of processes are at work. But a kind of obvious counter argument is, why would they want to destroy capital when it's their own capital that risks being destroyed? So this is the thing people will say, oh, well, lockdowns are obviously really bad for capitalism because look at all of the businesses that are going out of business. Obviously, that's not good. So why in a war, if you're going to destroy so much capital, why would anybody willingly do that when it could be their own capital that will be destroyed? Just missing a step there, I think.
Yeah, so they don't want to destroy capitalism, obviously, right? But Marx's point is that it must fundamentally work towards dissolving itself, whether they like it or not, because they have got to resolve the crisis, and so they've got the breakdown tendency. They've got an overaccumulation or a surplus of capital. They've got to try and fix that, and that one of the ways they do that is by devaluing the capital, making production cheaper. So they have to work towards making production go towards the price of production going towards zero. On one side of thing, they also need to monopolize industry. So part of how they do that is they destroy their competition, particularly the monopoly capitalists will particularly focus on destroying smaller and medium capital, so that they can then absorb that capital cheaply into their own operations.
Yeah, and this can take the form of competition between nations.
Yeah, yes, absolutely.
That's what I'm getting at. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's when that contradiction is intensifying, as it is now, particularly between the US and China. That's when the potential for a world war erupts, and that's essentially what happened with the First World War and the Second World War as well. You had a massive overaccumulation of capital. You had the Great Depression, and the only way of actually solving that crisis was not to raise the wages of the working class. It was to destroy them along with the surplus capital that the system was suffering from.
Mm-hmm. So to go back to Kliman's objection here, it seems to me that what he believes is that you can devalue capital on the level of financially or in terms of old debt, and that without destroying the physical capital or not all of it, you could have a massive devaluation and give the remaining monopoly capitalists the opportunity to do kind of exactly what you're talking about, which is buy up the capital of the competition, and buy it up really cheaply, so that even at a reduced rate of profit, you're still adding to the mass. That the mass would actually decline, the mass would shrink of abstract value. Not of the dollars that say that the mass was worth would be reduced, but the rate would be increased. The rate of profitability would be increased, even if a great deal of production was automated and the amount of value in each commodity was really small. So, you could get to a point where you buy what's now $1 billion company for a couple $1 million or something like that. So what's wrong with that picture of getting out of what otherwise might be called a breakdown? What's the difference between World War II or the Great Depression and the kind of breakdown that Grossman is talking about? Is maybe another way to ask that same question.
I mean, on the latter point, just that it would be a bigger breakdown. Like more of the capitalist economy would break down than before. So in Germany in 1923, when you had hyperinflation, production fell by something like 50%. And you then had roughly 50% of the workforce thrown out of work. So a bigger crisis would see production fall by an even greater amount, and an even greater amount of the working class thrown out of work. So
what's to stop a state coming in, seeing that going on, and deciding through kind of base monetary policy and just the implementation of authority, keeping production going on a level that the actual useful goods would be produced, and then providing currency to. I mean, I guess the inflation would be the problem, but providing money for the through what Yang would what is the basic income or something to all the unemployed workers, so that you keep the commodities produced, and even though the value is tiny, through state authority, you keep the system going. What's to stop that from happening? Just something like inflation, I guess, primarily, right?
Yeah, inflation's going to end up being the problem there. They might be able to do it for a while, for a hypothetical number of years, but they won't be able to do it forever. Money itself is a commodity. It tends to devalue the more productive the productive forces become, the more abundantly we produce. So that's fundamental, and this is what the right-wing libertarians don't get. They just see the money printing as the problem, rather than a symptom of our abundant our productive forces becoming more abundant. So, and the reason they're talking about a universal basic income is to devalue, is to cut the value of labour below its real value. So benefits are part of the wage, right? Like if you add up all of the wages and all of the benefits, that's your total wage. So they want to reduce the outlay on that total wage, and a universal basic income is a way of doing that. Maybe a lot of workers will go for that because it's better than not being paid at all. But again, it's unsustainable, because the amount of universal income that's being deposited to your account is still going to tend to devalue.
And there's talk of controlling inflation by, if the state deposits the money into your account, well, they'll just take the deposits out again if inflation gets too high.
Exactly, which then will create a rebellious layer of the working class.
So just to go over this one more time, or Kliman's objection here is that, his political objection is that this leads to kind of a fatalism. If we believe this about that capitalism will have a final breakdown, that leads us to a fatalistic kind of politics. But his other objection is technical, and he claims again that this has to do with equating or basically what he says is Grossman talks about value, abstract value in terms of money, perhaps not even in terms of money, but just in terms of value, and that he ought to be talking about things in terms of prices and physical commodities and units and things like that as well, in order to really demonstrate that this crisis would be terminal. It seems to me, by us talking about one of the ways in which this could be overcome through something like basic income and showing the necessity for breakdown nonetheless, just, maybe not very well in this podcast, but at least gesturing toward why it would still be a tendency towards breakdown, that we may be beginning to address that objection, and that it could be worked out in terms of dollars and prices, as well as value, as Grossman works it out in his. Do you think that's true, that work could be done? And does Kliman and is Kliman misunderstanding Grossman's argument altogether? I mean, you said at the start that he was trying to claim that Grossman was talking on the level of appearance, despite despite seeming not to. Is he wrong about that?
Yeah, these accusations it's a straw man. It's not something Grossman did. Grossman started with the essentials, like with a simplified version of capitalism, but then worked back towards how capitalism really works in the real world. And one of the things the thing is that Grossman simplifies it so that use values are the same as values, right? In the main scheme that gets looked at in his abridged version, but in the full version, there are other schemes that don't do that. But so this is the one that gets looked at the most. So it looks like he's not addressing use values separately, but he does do that. I mean, he does do it in the abridged version anyway, but he does it more in his other work, and he does it in response. He does it particularly in responses to criticisms of the book. So Otto Bauer's wife criticized Grossman for not doing this, Helen Bauer, and he came back and said and pointed out that she was wrong, and that she was suggesting that use values could continue to be expanded without devaluation. So it was like she made a very elementary error. Kliman is basically, I mean, he acknowledges that Grossman did. He says it's something like, it's strange that Grossman didn't get this right, because he does talk about it, but he only quotes like one passage of Grossman. There's like numerous passages in Grossman that address this. And he says that Grossman only does it through intuition, but that's not right. He does it through math. So I just don't know where he's getting this. I don't know if maybe he just hasn't read all of Grossman's work or something.
Yeah, that was what Rick Kuhn said, that some of the things that some of his work is still just in German. It's the translations haven't even come out yet, and especially a very important chapter of of accumulation and breakdown, the final chapter.
The final chapter just wasn't even a part of the abridged version. It was completely excluded. And that's the chapter Grossman talks most about class struggle in.
Okay, so I mean, if that's the explanation for the mistake in Kliman's argument that he hasn't read Grossman's full work, and that Grossman addresses his concerns, in works that are still just in German, then that's the explanation. It seems.
Can I just point out, I have read that stuff, and I
course.
I can't read German. I've read the stuff that is in English.
Okay.
Right. Oh, I see.
So that, I don't think that's an excuse. I'm just wondering if he just hasn't read all of Rick's work.
Well, it's possible that he has read it, but I noticed that he has a tendency to read things really, really, really closely. and then he reads into things. Like, I noticed he used a quote from Marx that was like, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall can't explain, I might be mangling this, but can't explain the export of capital abroad. And then he uses that to say that, like, that's never the explanation ever for anything. It was like, well, it's quite clearly that Marx is talking about a very specific instance here. And he uses that to say, well, Marx says that can't ever be the basis of a breakdown tendency. I think I've probably mangled that. But at least it was this line that he took and he just impregnated it with a ton of meaning. I noticed that he's like that. He reads things very closely, but I wonder, maybe he's missing the whole picture. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, if I remember correctly, to come to Kliman's defense, Kliman says that it's not that doesn't necessitate, well, in the case of sending getting labor abroad, so the tendency to rate of profit to decline doesn't necessitate getting cheaper labor abroad. But that it could be a factor in driving capitalists abroad, that you could still get profitable labor at home, just not at the same rate, not as much. And so,
I should say,
I mean, the big thing in the breakdown theory is the inevitability and the necessity that's implied, and
right.
And so Kliman is arguing not about this ever being a factor, but about it being necessary, it being fated. But anyway.
Yeah, I should say that, I could.
Even though he hates my guts, I always want to jump to his defense,
I was going to say, well, that's the thing, is that I have a huge amount of respect for Kliman, so I'm always careful. Like, I'm probably accusing him of something that's not right, because he's a genius,
Right.
But then so
what were you going to say? What were you going to say, Ted?
Well, I'm not fully convinced that he's rescuing Marx, because it from this piece, it seems like he's arguing for a harmonistic theory of capital accumulation, which would be, what the likes of the German Social Democrats did and the Austrian Social Democrats did, which is what Grossman was countering in the first place, because he says that in his equations, he uses these sort of binary equations that the growth rate of circulating constant capital tends towards an equalization of value. That's what he's saying. So he's saying that the production is becoming more and more harmonious. That there isn't a oversupply of investment that can't be reinvested. So that just, in terms of like his labor theory stuff's good, but in terms of the way that then is applied in a dialectical way to an accumulation process, because it's both. Capitalism's a labor process and an accumulation process, or a valorization process. That's where he seems to just get it wrong.
Listen, we've been talking for about an hour, and what I try to do is have 2 sessions for this, one for the public and one for patrons. I don't know how much more time you two have, or nor do I know how much more time I have that I'm actually going to be conscious. But would you be would you guys be willing to get a second link and continue this conversation a little bit in terms of the motivations or the political background of this debate? Like, to what extent is this about something other than what it appears to be about? Like, to what extent is it about? Well, you said at the outset about advocating for reform in this particular moment, and I mean, I happen to know, like I said at the outset, that Andrew Kliman, since the election of Trump, has become more and more convinced that the task of socialists and Marxists today is to fight off the right-wing reactionary forces. And if that means supporting center right-wing candidates, then so be it. Anyway, so in the second half, we might be take our gloves off a little bit politically for the patrons. And this will give me an opportunity to try to weasel $5 out of a MHI member so they can get the information and give it to Kliman. All right, but would you guys be willing to do that?
Sure. And I also want to ask, if Kliman's wrong, well, how can we use Grossman's work to understand our present moment? Because, in 2019, they were saying a crisis is looming and everybody seems to have forgotten about that. So I'm curious if
it's happening in a way, right? We've got it going. But
oh yeah.